Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to cover the Alatortsev variation of the Queen's Gambit declined. This is going to be the first detailed variation video in the series. And the reason why I've chosen the Alatortsev variation is because it's quite unlike the main lines or the mainer lines, that's not a word but still, or the more common variations of the Queen's Gambit declined, in the sense that it leads to completely different positions, both strategically, tactically, and pawn structure-wise. And that's why it may be a good choice for Queen's Gambit declined players to adopt this variation and to start playing something new. Firstly, less experienced players, less experienced d4 players with white will not really know what to do against this. And if they somehow stumble into the main lines of the Alatortsev, they could be in trouble. Okay, as most of you have requested, I will be covering all 11 videos of detailed variations from Black's perspective, because the Queen's Gambit declined is a defense for Black. Okay, let's start. The first thing I would like to point out, once we get into the opening, so we have d4, d5, the classical response, we have the Queen's Gambit c4, we have e6, Queen's Gambit declined, and knight to c3 by white. One more thing, some of you have requested the Queen's Gambit accepted video in this series. The Queen's Gambit accepted is a different opening and it's going to be covered separately. It's not going into the Queen's Gambit decline series because it's, I may as well do the English with the Queen's Gambit decline. It's a different opening. So I'm going to do the Queen's Gambit accepted when it's voted. And I don't really choose the how or in what order I record the openings. I put it up for a vote and the patrons decide which openings they want to see first. So I'm going to put it up for a vote in the next cycle, and whenever it comes up, it comes up. I know that it should have been recorded immediately after this. Same as, for example, after the Rimco Indian, I should have recorded the Bogo Indian, but yeah, okay, I think this is better. Okay, so we have c4, e6, knight c3. And now into the Alatortsev variation, we play the move bishop e7. And the move bishop e7 is quite common in the Queen's Gambit declined in conjunction with other moves. But if you play it on move 3 with Black before developing your knight to f6, then it could lead to different positions. Now, what's the meaning of bishop e7? Well, in normal Queen's Gambit declined lines, once you play knight f6, white has the option of playing the move bishop g5. So if you go knight f6, bishop g5 is a resource that white could use and very often does use, pinning your knight, putting pressure on the d5 square indirectly, and also putting pressure on the e4 square indirectly. So if Black, let's say, does nothing, let's say Black plays a6, then even a move such as e4, which is positionally very good for white, is possible, because now if you take, for example, knight takes is possible because the knight is pinned. So this is just one example. So the move bishop e7 avoids that annoying pin. And of course, bishop g5 is not possible. Okay, so one thing is, Black is not going to be developing his knight. He wants to see what white is trying to do. And very often, Black is going to develop his knight only after white has developed his knight to f3. So it's sort of a waiting game. On the highest level, the Alatortsev is played way more often than on club levels and lower levels, because I think it's very complicated and not many people understand why bishop e7 should be a move before knight f6. The thing is, once you play bishop e7, you're giving yourself a bit more flexibility, but you are giving your opponent a bit more flexibility as well. If they go knight f3, and that's what we are going to cover first, and that's the main move, and you go knight to f6 and they go bishop to g5, we have now transposed to normal Queen's Gambit declined lines which have been played a million times. They don't have to go bishop g5, that's just the most common move. They could go bishop f4 or c takes d5 or queen to c2 or g3 or e3. Doesn't matter. we are now in mainer line territory. So if knight f3, knight f6 is played, this is no longer the Alatortsev variation per se, and it's more commonly reached via different move orders. So we are not going to be dealing with this position in this video, because we are going to see it at least 5 or 6 times in separate videos, and we are going to look at continuations from here. Today we are going to focus on main lines of the Alatortsev, or, well, when players actually play the Alatortsev variation. So if white wants to go for this, and I would advise white not to go for this unless he knows it, but if he knows it, then yeah, it's a very good variation to fight him. If white goes for this, the games are much sharper than the normal Queen's Gambit declined, and we're going to see why. Okay, so the way to play this position with white, if you want to accept the Alatortsev, you have two options. You can either play bishop f4 or you can take on d5. Now both of these moves signify a much different structure than what is common for the Queen's Gambit decline. Now let's look at bishop to f4 first. Bishop f4 is a fairly logical move. You can't play bishop g5. It's obvious why. There's the bishop on e7 and there's a queen on d8. There's no knight on f6. So this is the most active square for your bishop. You want to play the move bishop f4 so that you can play e3, so that you can develop your kingside and castle. So this is the second most common move in the Alatortsev, but this leads to the Blackburn variation, which is going to be covered separately, or the Harwitz attack, as it's also known. So after knight f6, e3, castles, knight to f3. This is now the Harwitz attack, or the Blackburn variation, which is going to be covered in a separate video, so we are not going to be focusing on this. We are going to be looking at the move c takes d5. And if you want to accept the Alatortsev variation, c takes d5 is the way to do it. After c takes d5, the next two half moves are forced. E takes d5 has to be played, and white plays bishop f4. There simply is no better move. And now we have the crazy Alatortsev stuff, which I just love these positions. They are nothing like the Queen's Gambit declined, and they are way more aggressive. The pawn structures are far less safe, and games end in a draw much rarely than in the normal Queen's Gambit decline. Okay, so here black has two moves. One of them is knight f6, one of them is c6, or sorry, with different arrow orders, knight f6 and c6. c6 goes for a sort of Carlsbad pawn structure. So if c6, which is the main move, white could go e3, and we now have the thematic Carlsbad. Now this is something that we are going to be covering in the exchange variation as well. However, it's quite different in the Alatortsev, because black's bishops are very aggressive. There is no knight on f6, there is no bishop on g5. White hasn't played bishop d3 yet, and the bishops haven't been exchanged yet. So black is going to continue with bishop f5. And one thing that should be mentioned here is, since white hasn't developed his kingside yet, he has different options. So minority attack is not the only way to play this structure. However, if you don't know this position, if white stumbles into this without knowing the theory, then he probably is going to try to transpose to the exchange variation and try to go for a normal minority attack. However, here we see the point of the Alatortsev for black. The bishop on c8 is no longer locked in behind its own pawn chain. Black has no issues developing the bishop. So the Alatortsev is one variation where black gets to choose to simplify his strategic plans in the game, or to simplify not having to develop this bishop. And same as in the exchange variation, as soon as c takes d5, e takes d5 happens, this bishop is free. Now the difference between the exchange variation and the Alatortsev is that white has way more options, and one of them is he can use this bishop as a tactical liability, and it is a tactical liability, and this is the main reason why these positions tend to be extremely sharp. Okay, so we are following the main line after bishop to f4, c6, e3, and bishop to f5 for black. This is the main line of the Alatortsev. And here, believe it or not, the main move is g4. Why do you play g4? You are gaining space. You are gaining a tempo on the bishop. You are chasing the bishop back. And very often, if the bishop goes back, to e6, then fine. You have achieved something. The bishop is no longer on its best possible diagonal in the position. If you continue with bishop g6, well, okay, h4. For the moment, it gives up a pawn. But even so, I'm not sure this pawn is such a big deal. Opening up the h file is great. Perhaps continuing with knight f3 and then simply following up with h4, h5 would force black to a concession with, for example, h5 or h6. So in any case, you are gaining space and black wants to put this bishop back. This is just a better move to make sure you're not such a huge, it's not such a huge tactical liability. Okay, and in this position, the main move is h4. Seemingly sacrificing a pawn. Now, after h4, bishop takes h4 has been played a couple of times, and after bishop takes h4, queen to b3 is the main move. You have basically removed one of your pieces from the queen side, so white is now changing sides and trying to play on both sides of the board. Anish Giri has played this against Wesley So. Wesley So won with black with the move g5. And after bishop to e5, attacking the rook f6, bishop to h2, I think, yeah, okay, bishop takes g4. Black has now won 2 pawns and is simply better. So it's not that easy. And it can be taken, but if we turn on the engine after bishop takes h4, this is just, I don't normally do this, but the position is more than +1. So after queen to b3, if we follow this line, g5 wasn't the most precise move. And after g5, bishop to e5, f6, he shouldn't have moved the bishop perhaps queen takes b7. But after bishop to h2, bishop takes g4, queen takes b7 is just, on a grandmaster level, probably better for white. I wouldn't say it's a decisive advantage, it's +1, but I think black has more than enough compensation for the pawn, with his piece activity, with the fact that black's king is in the center. White can still probably castle after something like knight e2 and castles queenside. And yeah, this bishop coming back is annoying. So now the engine gives it more than +1. So I just want to say that it's very complicated and that I don't think it should be taken, the pawn should be taken. However, on a club level, perhaps that might be a good practical decision. Just be aware of queen b3 infiltrations. Okay, let's continue. The main move, though, is knight to d7. And now white has two ways to continue, either g5 or h5. I both, in a sense, defend the h4 pawn. So now that knight d7 has been played, I don't think queen b3 is as effective, and queen takes b7. Okay, so I think g5 is a better move, it's the main line. h5 is met with knight h6, that's the difference, and after bishop to e2, now the move knight b6 can be played, thus stopping queen b3 and ideas like that. And I think, despite having slightly awkward knights, I think this position is fine for black. After g5, though, h6 has to be played to stop further advances. Now this very annoying g6 move, and you basically, you don't want to take, that's quite loose. You develop instead, allow white to trade, take with the bishop, something like bishop d3 and knight h5. And again, black is fine, but you can obviously see the difference between this position and many other Queen's Gambit decline positions, or what you imagine the Queen's Gambit decline to be. This is very sharp, and it gets very sharp very soon. And as opposed to, let's say, the exchange, or the classical, or the orthodox, or I don't know, the Lasker, this is much more like a semi-Slav position, or a Karo-Kan even, and that's what makes it more aggressive. Now this idea with bishop f5 and bishop f4 is also similar to many Torre or London system setups. White, of course, doesn't have a pawn on c3. But since the bishops are being developed to these two squares, very often there will be b2 and b7 stuff to be concerned about, queen b3, queen b6, bishop a5, bishop a4, and stuff like that. So the patterns are quite different to the normal Queen's Gambit declined. I think this position resembles a Slav or a semi-Slav more, or the middle game patterns resemble a Slav or a semi-Slav more than they do a Queen's Gambit declined. Okay, so this was the move c6, and after e3, which is the only move, or the best move, bishop f5, we were looking at g4. Now white doesn't have to go crazy with g4, white can go knight g2 e2, but after knight d7, knight g3, bishop g6, these positions are quite normal, and I think you don't need tons of theory as in the main lines, so white can still decide not to go crazy. Let's just look at one sideline after c6. After c6, e3 is the main and the best move, but queen to c2 can also be played, which is, again, slightly less sharp than the main lines. Knight to f6, e3, once again trying to finish development. And now the downside of queen to c2 is that you wasted the tempo. You've allowed knight to f6, and now this allows black to try and win the bishop pair. So we have knight to h5. Of course, bishop e5 is the only square you have available, but after knight e7, the bishop is going to drop. However, white has the option to play bishop e2. Now, if you want, this is a good exercise. Pause the video and try to decide on what the best way to exchange pieces is for black. Okay, now theory says that knight e5, d5, g6, bishop takes, pawn takes is the most active for white and for black. Which side you'd rather be, I guess depends on your nature as a player. I'd much rather be white here, because I like the king safety, I like the pawn structure better. I think the doubled pawns or the doubled pawns on the e file are way more useful than the doubled pawns on the h file. So if the pieces get traded off, I believe white wins automatically. So this queen c2 stuff, I don't think should be punished with knight h5 unless you are extremely well prepared and ready to go into a middle game in which you basically have to win before the end game. That's just my opinion. If you want, this variation is a great one to study with white. And after bishop f4, c6, playing queen to c2 on, I think, higher levels, I'm not saying grandmaster levels, but maybe 2000, 21, 2200 might be a great move, because I don't think many players will have the knowledge or the experience to punish this move. Right, now let's cover the second move. The second move black could choose is not c6, it's knight to f6. Knight to f6 tries to be faster than with c6, giving you the options of knight h5, knight g4, knight e4, defending d5 same as c6, but giving you a bit more flexibility. Okay, the main move for white, again, of course, e3. And here black has two options. Of course, in this position, you can't play knight h5 because the queen is still here. Queen c2, of course, vacates that square, so knight h5 is possible. Here, you either go for bishop f5 or castles. We're going to look at castles first because it's far less complicated. And that's a sideline, not the most active move. So castles, bishop d3. And this is going to be thematic. London system bishops for white are going to be thematic for the Alatortsev. That makes it very aggressive compared to other lines. Of course, if you don't play bishop f5 with black and you castle, there is no better move for white than to occupy the diagonal. Okay, so now, here is how black tries to reach equality. He tries to bust open the center and prove that by eliminating central pawns, he's going to be opening up lines to both players' advantage, not only to white's, and that an attack on the king is not going to be as powerful when the center is blown open and black has chances for counterplay. So c5, knight g to e2, knight to c6, castles, c takes d4, knight d4, knight d4, e d4. And now we can see that although white's position is, I would say, easier to play, it's by no means decisively better or decisively more active. After something like bishop e6, I think black's position is fine, and the kingside attack is not so near. With both files open, both sides can play. And if I'm black, I'm seeking queenside counterplay. I'm going a6, b5, b4, trying to start a pawn storm over there, maybe play rook to c8, maybe double my rooks on the c file, maybe go queen b6, target the d4 pawn, of course not take it because bishop h7 wins the queen, but there are plans for both sides. Having said that, I don't like the move castles at all. I think it's a cowardly move and it avoids the main lines, and it simply accepts having a worst piece for no reason. So the main move and the best move is bishop f5. You need to develop your pieces to the best squares. Now, we are going to look at the downside of the move bishop f5 first, and then we are going to look at the main move. The obvious downside, which I've mentioned in many London system setups where both sides have played bishop f4, bishop f5, which used to be my preferred way to find the London system, you are leaving a horrible weakness on b7 and on b2, conversely. However, since white played the queen's gambit, he'd already gotten rid of his c-pawn, which means that his queen can enter the position, whereas black has chosen to play knight f6, which means he hasn't played c6, which means queen b6 is not possible. Hence, queen b3 is a very powerful move. You don't really have too many options. Queen c8 blunders your pawn with knight d5. Bishop c8 is kind of unnecessary here. You are retreating. So here we are going to be remembering the plans from the London system, and I know the London system is an opening I have yet to cover, but this is going to be a recurring theme, so this is something you should remember. Queen b3 can very often be met with the move knight c6 or knight c3 if queen b6 is played. Why is that? Well, if you take now queen takes b7, I have knight b4 with black, you have to go rook c1, I can castle, and it's not really clear that black has enough compensation for the pawn, but the piece activity is always going to be enough. And the engine agrees with that. If you are a type of player that likes material over quality and the initiative, well then play c6 instead of knight f6. If you are a dynamic player, then this is fine. I personally would hate to be black here. I hate having to compensate for lost material, but that's just me. I'm not a dynamic player. Okay, however, after knight to c6, queen b7 is not taken, the main move is g4, and now we enter the crazy world of the Alatortsev, and this is just something you have to be prepared for, but this is what makes the Alatortsev unique. Okay, g4. You don't take with the bishop. Now why? It's hard to prove, but after taking with the bishop, the theory says queen b7 is way better, and after knight b4, rook to c1, rook to b8, queen takes a7, white should be equal or better, despite having given up his g4 pawn and despite not being able to castle. And it's much better to take with the knight because basically you want your bishop to stay on this diagonal, not to allow queen back to c2 or rook to b1 or bishop to d3, which is probably the most important reason. So you take with the knight, which also introduces some threats. Now, of course, something like knight to f2 might seem trivial now, or knight takes e3, but it's really not. So let's imagine this bishop moving for some reason. Knight takes e3, pawn takes e3, bishop to h4 check can already be a menace. And I'm not saying that it works always, I'm not saying that it works here. I'm saying that having the knight on g4 is much better than moving the bishop away from its most natural diagonal and leaving the knight on f6 where it's far less active. So knight to g4 is objectively a better move from a tactical point. But the knight taking on g4, of course, is not a pawn sacrifice for white, and obviously the knight has left the defense of d5, so now we have queen takes d5. Of course, black has no better option but to take. Queen takes d5, knight takes d5, and now which side is more relieved to have traded off queens in such a crazy pawn structure? I think black, because he was the one under pressure, but this position now leaves white simply with a worse pawn structure, and I don't know, if I had to choose, I'd be black here. The main move here is bishop b4 check. You can also castle, giving up a pawn for activity, but no reason to do that. Bishop b4 is just better. Forcing a piece trade takes, and also stopping bishop takes c7, because knight c2 check wins an exchange. So, okay, let's say rook c1, stopping that. c6, a3, knight to d5, something like h3, knight g to f6, and let's say bishop to e5. And this position is, in my opinion, perfect for black. Better pawn structure, equal material for the moment. Black, of course, has given up his bishop pair, but how important is that? I mean, I wouldn't say the dark squared bishop is such a powerful piece in this position. I think it's much more important to have a light squared bishop because all of black's pawns are on dark squares. Having said that, the bishop pair is probably enough compensation for having an isolated pawn and 3 pawn islands instead of 2. Okay, so after bishop f5, queen b3 is, as I said, met with the move knight to c6. This is just something you have to learn. Okay, now let's look at the main move. The main move is knight g to e2. And again, for white, I would recommend queen b3 because it's the straightforward way to punish bishop f5. If you go knight g to e2, you're basically saying, well, play bishop f5, you are going unpunished. And black castles, which makes things way easier. Knight to g3, bishop e6. Again, bishop g6 runs into h4, h5, so be very careful. Whenever your bishop on f5 is attacked either by the g4 pawn or by the knight, think twice before moving it to g6. Okay, bishop to d3, now taking over the most active diagonal. The downside for black in this case is in fact that he is castled and he has given up the position of his king. So if white wants to, he could start a crazy attack and accept the worst position according to the engine, but hard to play for humans. Okay, c5, d takes c5, bishop takes c5, castles. Now here castles is the main move because white, I think, now changes direction from a tactical game in which he goes for an attack to a game in which he simply plays against the IQP. And this IQP is, I would say, more a weakness than a strength. Now, that's a very broad topic which I won't even start discussing in this video, but I think it's very hard to attack with the knight on g3 defending the position. Usually the side with the isolated queen's pawn doesn't want to trade pieces and wants dynamic compensation for the structural weakness. I just think with all 4 minor pieces defending the white king is going to be very hard. And as soon as white manages to trade off a couple of pieces, then the pressure is gone, and I would rather be white here. So to conclude, the Alatortsev variation, starting with bishop e7, is a very sharp line which most often transposes either to the main lines of the Queen's Gambit declined after knight f3, knight f6, or after the move bishop f4, it transposes to the Blackburn or the Harwitz attack. But if after bishop e7, white takes on d5 and e takes d5 is played, we now have the Alatortsev main line, bishop f4, the only move, wanting to play e3. Black can go knight f6 or c6. Very different moves. I would advise you to choose only one with black and master it, and then continue from there. Very fun opening for both sides. I think way more attractive than most Queen's Gambit declined variations. I hope you like it. Hope you like the video. Let me know what you think and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.